The number of households where the woman earns the same, more than, or is the sole earner has tripled over the last 50 years. However, in all of those marriages, women are still spending more time on chores and caregiving than their husbands.
Lawyer and activist Raj Kaur Khaira.
We have to stop seeing things as women's work. Women are not born with a chip in their minds that make them want to clean dishes. What is the root cause of sexism? To me, the root cause of sexism is where does that idea take hold and spread from one generation to the next? I believe that message is propagated through sexist custom and tradition, intergenerational propaganda.
Pink Ladoo.
Pink Ladoo.
Pink Ladoo project.
The first sexist custom you will encounter when you are a South Asian is the custom of a boy's birth being celebrated jubilantly and a girl's birth being ignored. They've been taught from birth, by virtue of customs like this one, that they are worth less than a boy. We have to stop gendering hobbies, gendering careers, gendering toys. If you want to deal with sexism, if you want to empower women, if you want to liberate women, you've got to deal with the thing that is at the root of why they are treated badly in the first place.
Welcome to the Virtuous Mindset.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm so glad to have you. I remember sitting here with Sean Williams not too long ago, and we were talking about AI and how that's going to impact the world. And he spoke so highly of you, I've got to say. But you are somebody who wears a number of hats. You're a lawyer, you're an investor, you're an author, you're an activist, you're the COO and co-founder of AutogenAI. What does it mean to you to have a virtuous mindset? We just Googled the definition just literally 2 seconds ago, but in your eyes, what is it?
For me, a virtuous mindset is a faith-led mindset. So I think it's acting, in accordance with the principles of your faith, whatever that may be.
That's a really interesting answer in terms of it being value-orientated. Talk to me about what faith means to you.
Something I've been hearing a lot recently, because, I've got some stuff going on in my personal life, is people will say, it'll be fine, have faith. And something my partner and I think about a lot now is how actually that's probably something we would have said at some point in our lives as well to people who, perhaps going through a challenge. And that's not what faith means to us anymore. There was a time when having faith might have meant believing that you will get your own way. So, it'll be fine, have faith. But now faith to me doesn't mean believing that you'll get your own way. Faith to me now means believing that no matter what happens, that is what's best for you, even if it's what you don't want to happen, or even if it's what something, someone might consider to be a tragedy or a personal sort of failure. I think now for me, having faith means believing that everything that happens is absolutely the best thing for you. And I think for me, that's what a virtuous mindset means. It means knowing that and believing that and living that. But also alongside that, it means acting in accordance with your faith's values. And for me, some central principles of my faith, and I'm a Sikh, is sort of acting with integrity, earning an honest living, things like that. So I try and keep those principles, front and center. And also remembering that whilst this world is lovely, there is so much more to life. And, purpose isn't just driven from activity. It's so much more than that. And so, I try and keep that front and center.
Yeah, I like that. That's nice. I've never had that answer, actually, that it's in relation to your faith, but no, interesting. As I said, I've looked into your career, and from looking and researching you strike me as somebody who's not afraid to say what they think. You fight for what you feel is right, especially on LinkedIn and especially on all of your posts online. And I was trying to piece together in my mind where that mentality comes from in terms of who you are today and who you are all about. So in order for us to be able to do that, I feel like we need to go back to the beginning of your journey. So talk to me a little bit about your earliest context in life, your upbringing, and how you got to where you got to.
That's such a great question. I've never really been asked that before. I mean, my earliest context in life, I am the children of immigrants. All 4 of my grandparents they've all deceased, completely and totally illiterate. I don't come from a highly literate, educated or, academic family. So for me, my earliest contexts were very non-academic. We are a community of immigrants. And so everything was about, community and staying in touch with people who looked like us and spoke the same language as us, so that everybody that was around us who was also an immigrant had a sense of community as well. I grew up in a very busy household. We lived on, in one of those classic terrace houses in like middle England, on a South Asian street with lots of other South Asian families who we were constantly in and out of each other's houses. And that was quite nice, actually, because I think it brought a sense of community to a lot of people whose families were probably living in other parts of the world. And so we all became each other's families. And, you know, these are people who I saw every single day, you know, and that's also why English isn't my first language. I often joke that, you know, sometimes it comes out in interviews and in other contexts that actually I learned another language first, and I think a lot in another language. So yeah, that was my earliest context. And then when I was 10, we moved to Canada as a family. There was a big sort of mass exodus of South Asians out of the UK into North America in the mid-90s. I guess we were like pursuing the Canadian or American dream, and my family was one of those. That, I think, laid the foundation quite firmly for who I think I would go on to become in life. It wasn't easy when we moved to Canada. Canada is a very different system to the UK, not least because healthcare is not free. And my family really struggled financially. It was my first real contact with what it means to not have enough, to, you know, worry about how the lights are going to be turned on or how the bills are going to be paid or where food's coming from. And I think that is sort of laid the foundation for who I would become and what I would value later on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, you know, you just talking about the fact that you were born and raised in the UK and then you moved to Canada. What was it like for you personally, having to like move from the UK to Canada? Because that must be really challenging to have to do that as a young person.
Yeah, I mean, it was really traumatic.
Yeah.
It was so traumatic. Like I
can imagine.
Yeah, it was. It's funny because it's one of those things that was like really exciting in the lead up to it. My family were really excited. They spent many years trying to get, you know, landed immigrant status so that we could go across, you know, as people did in those days. And then when we finally left, it was this like huge traumatic thing. Like everyone was like crying at the airport, and it was like, wait, didn't we like decide that we wanted to do this?
Yeah.
Like, why is everyone so sad now? And yeah, it was difficult. I mean, you know, we didn't have very much money. It was hard for my parents to get jobs. Everything was different. You know, accents were different. They drive on the other side of the road. All the food is different. Like, we still had the privilege of going from one English-speaking nation to another.
Yeah.
But it was still just so difficult. It was such a hard transition. And I think it sort of really shaped me. I think it's one thing that I think about a lot, actually, and something I've been thinking about recently is where did my views come from? Like, you know, how did I sort of end up holding some of the opinions I have? And I think for me, growing up in Canada, one of the hardest things for us actually was the fact that healthcare isn't free.
Yeah.
And that it's so expensive to be ill in Canada, and, you know, medicine is very expensive. And I'd obviously grown up in the UK where that wasn't a factor, especially in 90s Britain. And so for me, I think I've grown up with the privilege of knowing that another world is possible, that the status quo isn't all that's available to us. And I think that's one of the great benefits of actually living in two different countries that, you know, are very similar on the face of it, but also quite different. And I think that's kind of what opened my eyes at a very early age to different political systems, different social structures. How is it that one country can afford to give everyone healthcare for free and another doesn't?
Yeah.
And so I think I started thinking about those things at quite a young age. And I think that laid the foundation for the types of things I would come to be passionate about later.
That's crazy to me that you were thinking about these things from such a young age, and that you were, because when I think about when I was younger, you know, I was not thinking on those lines. And I think actually the fact that you have had two very different experiences, like you said, here we have the NHS in the US, it's completely different in that it's paid for, of course. And that for me is just, it gives you two very different experiences, and it probably makes you very adaptable as a person. Would you say that you've become quite adaptable over time, and that you've been able to just, you know, obviously because we said that you've moved from one place to the other, would you say that you've had to adapt to new experiences and change effectively?
I think so, potentially. I mean, I've never really thought about that. But one thing I would say about, you know, your comment on this is something that you never thought about. I think we hear this a lot, but for people who perhaps, you know, aren't aware of this, one of the main things that happens to children who grow up in poverty is that there is an actual loss of childhood, right?
Yeah,
you end up
you
growing
grow
up very
faster.
quickly. You end up thinking about things that you shouldn't think about at your age. there is a very sort of severe cliff that you drop off in terms
Yeah.
of, you know, when your childhood ends. And so I don't think it's that you just weren't thinking of those things. I think
I just didn't have those.
it's just a byproduct. You know, one of my friends laughs and says that we were forged in the furnace of poverty or whatever. And I think that's what it is. I think that it can sort of create quite a sharp loss of childhood, and that's probably where it came from. I wasn't like an exceptionally bright child thinking about these things. I think it was very situational. It's not something I ever thought about when we were living in the UK. And so it was completely situational and circumstantial. Am I adaptable? Maybe. I think moving at such a young age, and then my parents obviously moved back to the UK 8 years later, it kind of showed me that like packing up and trying new things isn't hard. And I think that is something that served me quite well. So I don't know if I'm adaptable or if it's just given me a sense of like things aren't impossible to do, and it's okay to try something even if it doesn't work, and even if it's something as big as moving across the world and setting up a home and a family and then changing your mind about it a decade later.
Yeah, no, interesting. And it's great that those experiences have really helped shape you and shaped who you are today. And one thing that I want to touch on, and we spoke about this just initially, was you being part of this experimental cohort at school at the age of 14. You were part of this, you know, you were taught this university philosophy course. Tell us a little bit more about that time and the context. I remember reading that post on LinkedIn and thinking, I've got to talk about this in this conversation with you. So,
I've never spoken about this before.
Yeah.
I shared that one LinkedIn post. So I guess for listener context, I went to school in Canada, and in Canada you have your normal subjects. So you've got like math, science, and then you have something called humanities, which is a combination of English and, let's call it, history. So you do it together as humanities, and you do humanities every single day. And normally in grade 8, so year 9, you do humanities, and then by year 10 it splits into English and history. So you don't do humanities anymore. I was a part of an experimental cohort where we did humanities into year 10, so grade 9. And my teachers sort of threw the curriculum out the window, like the national curriculum or provincial curriculum, because I grew up in the province of British Columbia. And it was just this complete experiment where they taught us they taught us the theories of about 70 different philosophers during that year. We had this subject every morning, every day, 5 days a week for a whole academic year. Our desks were arranged in a sort of a square so that we were all facing each other.
Cool.
And we would begin every morning with sort of a debate. And the debate would be based around whatever quote or image or symbol our teacher had put up on the whiteboard. And sometimes it would be, you know, the most complicated philosophical concept. Other times he would just like put a balloon in the middle of the room. And, you know, we would sort of really, at the age of like 13 and 14, we were sat in a room debating concepts like truth, virtue, morality, ethics, you know, having these really deep and meaningful conversations about like life and the universe, and studying actually like some very like complex adult literature, like not adult as in like X-rated, but adult as in these are the kinds of things that you would read perhaps if you were doing like a third year philosophy module at university. And it was really interesting because we were treated like intellectual equals with our teacher. And it's funny because the older I get, the more I think about that year.
Yeah.
You know, it really changed me. It really shaped the way I think. It shaped what I care about. You know, it would go on to influence the degrees I chose, the career I wanted to do, what I hold to be important in life. I think it was probably the most formational year for me.
Wow. To think that really decided what you'd pursue at uni. Like,
oh, completely.
That's mad. Wow.
It changed everything. Absolutely everything. I mean, and it wasn't that the entire school did Humanities 9. There were about 20 of us, and we were sort of hand selected to be a part of this experiment. And I think it was just the most intellectually stimulating year I have ever had at school or university. I've never felt that stimulated again. And I spent the rest of my academic career sort of chasing the high.
Even through uni? You didn't feel it?
I didn't feel it, no.
Wow.
Uni is a different beast. And, you know, I've done 2 degrees and I just didn't feel it through uni. And it was... there's something really powerful about being in a room full of 20 people every single day for around 90 minutes, where your teacher or your tutor is treating you like an intellectual equal. You're not being patronized. It's not being assumed that anything is too difficult or mature for you to understand. And you're being allowed to stretch your mind and think and debate and fight about things.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Yeah. You're not being told what to think.
Yeah.
And I guess you have learned how to think and how to develop those skills later on in life, which I think is quite useful, I guess.
Potentially, yeah. It remains to be seen if I've learned how to think.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I guess when you think about the education system, because I personally find that when I was at school, like, I don't know if I was stimulated at the level that you're describing. I mean, it's rare to find those kind of experiences where you feel like you're being treated like an intellectual equal, and that, oftentimes you're just learning from the school curriculum and then continuing on in life. What, from your perspective, needs to change from an education standpoint so that we are training young people to be in a position where they are able to think outside the box and they are able to, be stimulated at the level that you were, perhaps?
Education is quite challenging, isn't it? Because there's multiple competing priorities. That you've got the priority of ensuring that everybody comes out with a minimum level of literacy, sort of both in English and in maths and various other things. And then you've also got the challenge of making sure that people are sort of stretched and encouraged to think outside the box and think critically and, stretch their minds and their imaginations. It's tough. I think, our education system is completely underfunded and completely overstretched. We live in a society where education is segregated based on the means of your parents, And the fact that you can still go to a fee-paying school in this country and receive a quantifiably better education than somebody who goes to a state school is a travesty. But why are those other schools providing better educations? Well, they've got more resources, they've got, better equipment, better just facilities overall, and they've also got a much better student to teacher ratio. The classrooms are much smaller. Yeah, where teachers are able to spend more time with each individual student. You're allowed to have classrooms where you're sort of debating things and talking about things. Whereas, in state schools, 70% of the time, well, this is not a real statistic, this is one I pulled out the air, but a lot of the time is sort of spent just controlling the behavior of the classroom because there's so many other things that impact how children learn. So I think it's quite fanciful to try and talk about education and how children learn if we don't sort of deal with the social ills that prevent children from having the privilege of focusing on mind expansion in the classroom. If you're coming to school every day and you've not had a full warm meal in your belly for God knows how long, do you really care about what Shakespeare said about X, Y, and Z? So I think education is tough. And I think education is, one of many things in a society that creates well-rounded individuals. But I think our particular education system is a whole other subject.
Yeah. Well, story for another day, maybe. Let's move on and let's talk a little bit about another topic, which is Pink Ladoo Project, which is an initiative that you have put together. And I got to say that, Raj, when I came across this initiative, I was like, wow, there's somebody actually doing something and making a change. And
how did you come across it? How did it end up on your radar?
I remember this was when I initially got you to come on the podcast and I was researching all the work that you'd done. I was thinking to myself, okay, what do I talk to her about? What do I cover in this conversation? And then when I was looking on your LinkedIn, you had the Pink Ladoo Project, and then from that, going on the website and learning more about it, and of course going on your Instagram and seeing all those little short clip videos of what you've done. But I guess to provide some context for people listening, this is the campaign that you have set up to challenge sexist customs. It's all about celebrating a daughter's birth by offering Ladoo sweets to friends and family, when historically speaking that hasn't been the case. A daughter's birth will be celebrated, a daughter's birth will not be celebrated, a boy's birth will be celebrated. And to me, I just thought, I can't believe this is still taking place today. I don't know whether that's ignorant of me to think, how is this still taking place where daughters' births are not being celebrated? But can you give us a bit more context into Pink Ladoo Project and also how you came up with the whole idea?
Pink Ladoo has been running, and that's a great explanation. Thank you. I think,
Mix it up a little bit with the boys and girls. But
you sort of, you really hit the nail on the head there. So Pink Ladoo is a campaign I've been running now for 8 years. And for me, the central thesis behind Pink Ladoo is that I am a firm believer that many of our social ills we can thank sexism for many of those social ills. And what is the root cause of sexism? To me, the root cause of sexism is this idea that women are inferior to men. And where does that idea take hold? How does that message spread from one generation to the next, that women are inferior to men? I believe that message is sort of propagated through sexist custom and tradition. I think the sexist custom and tradition is like intergenerational propaganda, teaching one generation to the next that boys are superior to girls. And so for me, I think if you want to deal with sexism, if you want to eradicate sexism, if you want to empower women, if you want to liberate women, you've got to deal with the thing that is sort of at the root of why they are treated badly in the first place. And so I think, you know, the first sexist custom you will encounter when you are a South Asian is the custom of a boy's birth being celebrated jubilantly and a girl's birth being ignored. And I think it's very hard to then demand that women grow up and leave abusive marriages or demand pay rises if they've been taught from birth, by virtue of customs like this one, that they are worth less than a boy. And so for me, I think, you know, encouraging families to celebrate their daughter's birth is a very easy and friendly way of getting people to engage in the topic of sexism. It's very disarming. And I think, you know, complexity is a barrier to engagement. I think a lot of people want to deal with sexism. They want to do work to, you know, eradicate sexism, but often they're like, oh, I don't know where to start. And I think Pink Ladoo gives people a place to start. That like, if you can't do anything else, do this, you know. And I think it's quite a sort of easy to replicate call to action. It's been a tremendous success. I mean, you know, it has influenced the behavior of tens of thousands of South Asians across the diaspora. I launched it in October 2015, and within 3 or 4 months, Pink Ladoo were best-selling sweet across sweet shops in Australia, the UK, and Canada. You know, tens of thousands of families have celebrated their daughters' births by distributing Pink Ladoo in their networks. And so, and I don't make or sell Pink Ladoo. I'm just going to put that out there.
Say that.
Yeah, before someone emails me being like, I want to buy Ladoo. I'm like, I don't sell them. So I think it's been quite fascinating to watch. It's been amazing to have a central thesis that I think my community is ready to do something like this, and then watch it unfold and watch it take on a life of its own and catch on like wildfire. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah. How did you come up with this idea of setting up Pink Ladoo project?
So, I mean, the idea came to me in like various different stages. My sister is 10 years younger than me. And when she was born, the community reacted very badly. Lots of screaming and crying and, oh, it's a girl. And it was 2 years later, when my brother was born, that my mum and I were packing the boxes of Ladoo to distribute to announce his birth, that I said, oh, someone should start something to celebrate the birth of a girl. And I never really thought about it again. It was just kind of a passing comment. And that was based on my knowledge of South Asians at the time, where like I know that my community, we love to copy and one-up each other. I think as South Asians, we've all been to the first wedding that had like a chocolate fountain or an ice sculpture, and then every wedding had one thereafter. Does the same.
It's all, yeah, you're right.
So yeah. I kind of thought, well, if just one family does it, I feel like everyone else will copy, and wouldn't that be awesome? I just didn't think about it again until like 20-something years later. And lots was going on in my sort of professional life. And I thought, now is the time. And my friends started having children. And, the conversation around girls' birth started becoming alive again. And I was like, someone should come up with something to celebrate the birth of a girl. And then I heard about a dance group in Toronto selling Pink Ladoo to raise funds for their dance group. And I thought, that's the sweet. That's what it is. And that to me is more than a sweet. It's the symbol of a protest against sexist norms. So that's kind of how it came together.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you've had the idea as pretty much as a young child, and then it manifested many years later and took form. And now when you see it, like the movement that you've created, I remember seeing a post, I think it was the other day, it was a video of a woman that had left her marriage and they were celebrating. I think I saw that yesterday, it came up on my feed, and I thought, oh my God, this is amazing that they're celebrating the fact that she's come out of a really challenging marriage. But of course, it's difficult for the community as a whole to be able to accept some of these things. One thing that I want to talk about is that obviously what you've achieved so far is amazing in terms of women coming forward and actually, providing ladoos to their children and things. But I think there's still so much work that needs to be done in order to break down some of these sexist customs, particularly within South Asian households, which is something we've been talking about. From your perspective, what changes do we need to make in the next 10 to 15 years that are going to hopefully bring us closer to breaking down patriarchy?
So I did a post recently where I asked, the internet, I asked men actually, what are some of the hobbies or career interests or toys that you were interested in as a child that you were told aren't for you. Boys can't do it. And it got shared on some sort of major feminist accounts, and I've had over 700 replies.
Wow.
And what I thought was really interesting in some of those replies was that cooking and baking was probably amongst the most popular answer. So many young boys wanted to, cook either to help their families out or as a hobby, and were told no. And then a few weeks later, I sort of came across this study by the Pew Institute in the States that said that the number of households in the US where the woman earns the same, more than, or is the sole earner, right, in the marriage has tripled over the last 50 years. However, in all of those marriages, women are still spending more time on chores and caregiving than their husbands.
Oh,
And the only scenario in which women spend less time on caregiving than their partners is where the woman is the sole earner. So where the woman's the only one making more money, she spends less time on caregiving activities. But even in that marriage where she's the sole earner, she's spending as much time on chores as her partner, okay? And in every single marriage scenario, so where the woman is earning less than, the same as, more than, or is the only earner, in all of those marriages, men are spending and have more time for leisure activities.
Yeah.
Okay? So I think one thing that needs to fundamentally change if we are going to make strides in any direction is we have to stop seeing things that relate to a household as women's work. And I think we have to stop gendering hobbies, gendering careers, gendering interests, gendering toys. I think if we are going to move towards a more sex or gender equal society, we have to stop seeing things as innately for men and innately for women. Women are not born with a chip in their minds that make them want to clean dishes, and men are not born with a chip in their minds that makes them want to change the oil in a car. Both
You're
sexes
right,
are equally capable. So for me, I think it's quite fanciful to imagine a world in which all these things are magically equal without taking, a conscious look at what our situation is like within the domestic sphere. And I think it's also very important, I give that example for a reason, and I give it deliberately, that we tend to think that the East is more sexist than the West, and that is a fallacy, in every level, on every measure. Actually, in some measures, India, for example, is doing better. Like, there are more women that participate in certain STEM degrees than you'd have here, and Angela Seni writes about this at great length. So I think it's important to resist the urge to think that in the UK, US and Canada we live in some sort of gender equal utopia, and it's places like Pakistan and India and China that are treating women badly. No, we are treating women badly everywhere.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. I was thinking you're right, we're treating women badly everywhere you can think of. And I guess it's so interesting to me when you say that men and women have gender, specific roles in society, and you were saying the whole point about domestic chores are more, women are going to do those domestic chores. And I can relate to that because I remember when I was growing up, my mum always taught me, and I guess from her perspective she was just trying to help me, but she always taught me that, she always said, Shivani, if you ever go to someone's house and it's a family member's house, make sure that you always ask to help, or always go in, if you're at someone else's house, offer to help if they're in the kitchen. Don't just sit there. And always, every single time, even to this today, I see women in the kitchen helping and cooking, and men sitting down and not offering to help. And it's things like that need to change, like you say. And it's
so funny,
bizarre to me. Yeah,
I shared a video. It went viral on Pink Ladoo.
I've seen it too. I know what you're going to talk about.
The lads, these boys recorded lol, family hangout when you're brown, and it was the cousins hanging out, the boy cousins. All the aunties cooking, none of the men are cooking. The kids chilling in the living room, and the women are doing all the childcare, and the men are in a corner getting drunk and hanging out. It's just it just needs to stop.
Yeah, no, agreed. I want to move on and I want to talk a little bit about your two amazing books, right? So the first of your two amazing books is Stories for South Asian Supergirls. This was declared the book of the week and the month by the Times of the Guardian. 100% proceeds going to charity. Volume 2 is out spring 2024, Stories for South Asian Super Kids. For those that don't know, can you tell us a little bit about Stories for South Asian Supergirls? I read it a couple of months ago, loved it, and also why you wrote it.
So Stories for South Asian Supergirls is a collection of biographies of notable South Asian women. I wrote it because for multiple reasons. So the first reason is that the collections of biographies of notable women that were being released at that time did not contain a material number of non-white women. So it was kind of like, white women's history kind of being taught as mainstream history again. And secondly, because I am tired of this idea that South Asian women are these victims sitting in the East that need saving and that need white saviors. And I know personally in my own life, my grandmother was a single mother and, born in 1924 and raised 3 kids on her own. Like I already come from a legion of pretty powerful women. I know that we as South Asians hail from and have many powerful South Asian women in our history. We just don't know about them because whose interest does it serve to teach us about any of these women, right? And so I really wanted people like me and you, but also the next generation to have this resource at their fingertips where they can actually, factually debunk the sort of myths that are being propagated about us in mainstream media that we are weak, submissive victims. We're not. And this is a collection of stories about women who have done remarkable things, who have been highly educated, who have run empires, who have, traveled to space and, founded their own workers' unions. Like, it's just people who did amazing things. And, I think it's really important that every South Asian has a resource like this that they can look at and, tap into their history through.
Yeah. I was just saying to you earlier that Nadia Hussein's, the one with Nadia Hussein was my favourite one, just because her being on Great British Bake Off and then you seeing what she's achieved now. And initially, I think when she was on Great British Bake Off, she was nervous. We talked about this, that she was nervous and that she was, suddenly, developing her skill set within the culinary space. And now she's in a position where she's doing all these amazing things in that space. And she's paved a way for so many women that look like her and can say, actually, I want to go and pursue that path. Have you got any favourites I'm sure you have multiple favourites, but have you got any favourites that you can think of in terms of like stories or accounts?
Yeah, so one that jumps out to me most actually is Kaur Khaira. And Pritam she's probably in her late 90s now. And like my grandmother, she is, she was born in the 1920s, she's illiterate. And she moved to Canada in the sort of 70s and 80s, and she was a farm worker. And she led some of the farmer strikes in Canada and fought for improved labour conditions, and sort of really helped establish that labourers union in that part of Canada. And it was remarkable to me because I didn't learn about Pritam until I think 2016 or 2017. I saw like a news article get shared about her on Facebook, and it stopped me in my tracks because I was just like, how have I never heard about this woman? She's like, she looks like everybody's grandma. She has the same background as most Punjabi grandmothers, yet she did something so like foundational that you would never expect from a woman with that kind of background and who looks that way. And, I feel like every single Canadian and South Asian Canadian should know about her, but yet nobody does. And I think for me, when I read her story, that was kind of like quite a galvanizing moment that, her story and the stories of so many women like her need to be in other people's hands.
Yeah, definitely. I want to move on to your second book, which is the feminist festive picture book, The Night the Reindeer Saved Christmas, which is all about debunking the myth that it's an all-male team that make Christmas happen. You've got South Asian Santa Claus, you've got Black Mrs. Claus, you've got diverse elves. Tell me about where the inspiration for this book came from.
Again, it came from a news article that I saw in in 2016. That was like, hey, did you know that all of Santa's reindeer are female? Because male reindeer lose their antlers in winter and female reindeer don't. Therefore, all of Santa's reindeer are female and are, delivering Christmas every year. And I just found that to be so hilarious. Like, it's one of the most textbook examples of the women doing all the work and a man taking the credit, which was, quite a lively topic at the time when I came across that article. And I couldn't get it out of my head because every time I would tell people that fact, their eyes would just widen with disbelief. And, you know, you tell kids and they would be like, oh my gosh, really? And I thought, you know, this should be, somebody needs to shoehorn this fact into a story, into a kid's picture book so that they can learn about this. And then that somebody ended up being me. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that entire book is me. It's literally been reverse engineered around that fact. And also just the idea that, you know, Christmas is always presented as, you know, by white people, for white people, when actually there are more Christians in India than there are Sikhs in the entire world. There are more Christians in China than there are people in Britain. You know, Christianity is like, I think white Christians are actually a minority within those who classify themselves as Christians.
Yeah.
The fact that Jesus himself is not white, you know?
Right.
So I think there's this diversification of Christmas is needed. And that obviously is a topic for another time. But I think it's very important when you look at the legacy of white supremacy and how Christianity helped enforce that. And I think if you don't correct this idea that like Jesus was a white guy, you kind of stand the risk of it being used to perpetuate white supremacy again. And I think I remember how old I was and probably where I was when I realized that, whoa, Jesus was brown and Bethlehem is in Palestine, not in Europe. Like, I think I was just like, what is going on here? Like, how did I not know this? I learned about this guy every year, you know? But it just never occurred to me that he probably had tan skin and like dark curly hair.
Yeah, well, I really like the idea, and I like the fact that you have, you know, like you said, you've got a South Asian Santa Claus, a Black Mrs. Claus. I really like the fact that you have honoured all cultures, and I think that's really important, especially for young children, you know, because I think sometimes with storybooks, like when I was growing up, I didn't see any like storybooks where I could find a representation of me, or that was very difficult to find.
It's still difficult to find. Yeah. I think it's only something like 4 to 10% of kids' books have an ethnic minority character or something, and like usually it's like the sidekick, it's not a main character. And I think like there's something about animals as well. I can't remember. I think there's more animals in kids' book than there are like people of color. Like it's just bizarre. It's not in your head. There literally is like, they're missing in the literature, right?
Yeah, true. So from the books that you've written, what's the impact been from rolling them out? Because I can imagine that it's been so positive and so amazing for so many people, but in your words, what has it been like?
I mean, I don't think I'll rest easy until everyone has one. And so whilst they've sold really well, like they, you know, I just am like, I feel very passionate that every child should know that Santa's reindeer are female. And so until that happens, I don't think I will sort of let up on that. And Sean, who you mentioned earlier, he laughs that like, you know, every time I say, did you know Santa's reindeer are female? He's like, yes, I know, Raj, because I see your posts getting rolled out every year where you're banging that drum at Christmas time. So I think it's really important. I think it's really important for children to, you know, be able to conceptualize women doing non-traditional things. Yeah. And I think it's really important that men are sort of de-centered out of some of these narratives. I think it's important for both boys and girls that happens. Yeah. So I won't rest until everyone everywhere
has one. Everyone knows about it. Everyone's aware. No, agreed. The last thing that I want to talk about, the last topic that I think is really important to cover, is your most recent initiative, which is South Asian Therapists, which is an organisation that you have set up and founded. Tell us a little bit about South Asian Therapists and how this whole this whole idea came about, essentially.
So South Asian Therapists was, for better or worse, a bit of a brain fart during COVID. I was getting a lot of distressed messages from women on Pink Ladoo who were just struggling with like not being allowed out of their house and, you know, like just kind of being stuck at home with strict families. And I was thinking, actually, you know, I need a resource that I can point everyone to in terms of like getting some mental health support. So I just put a call out saying, hey, if you're brown and a therapist, let me know and I'll put your name in a spreadsheet and, you know, share it with my followers. And like 500 therapists replied. Wow. And I thought, whoa, like this is a thing in and of itself. And then I decided to set up SouthAsianTherapist.org, which is a directory of South Asian mental health professionals, majority of whom, I think like 70% of them are from the US and then Canada and then the UK. It is now the largest resource of its type in the world. We've got a substantial social media following. Last year, over 100,000 people used the website to try and find a therapist. It's kind of taken on a life of its own. You know, it's become this massive South Asian mental health community. I unfortunately don't get to devote as much attention to it as I would like, but it sort of sits in the background and like rumbles on. because just by virtue of it existing, people are finding what they need. And I've had hundreds, if not thousands, of messages over the last 2 or 3 years with people thanking me that they were able to find culturally sensitive and responsive therapy because they found, a South Asian therapist through the directory.
Yeah, I think it's amazing what you've done with that, because I feel like it fills a much needed gap in the market, especially in terms of the fact that you're right, it's so difficult to find a therapist, to get access to those individuals that are South Asian, particularly in the community. But one thing I want to say is that there's so much stigma that's attached to seeking mental health services within our community, and also there's a lack of awareness and lack of understanding of it. And there was a Sky News article that I came across, and I think it was the same therapist, Dr. Tina Mystery, if I'm not mistaken. I think she mentioned it, but it discussed the fact that South Asian people who access mental health services felt the services didn't match their cultural or conceptual needs. And it goes to this point of the one size all approach doesn't fit all. And it made me think about members of my own family, that would they be inclined to seek mental health services or go to their closest mental health clinic, knowing fully well that the person on the other side doesn't really understand their background, doesn't really understand their heritage, doesn't really understand where they've come from. No, they're probably less inclined. Whereas with the introduction of something like South Asian therapists, it's feeling that much needed gap. What I wanted to ask you was that for those individuals that are adamant about not getting mental health services, mental health support, knowing fully well about South Asian therapists, how do you convince them to go and pursue the help they need? Because I feel like these issues are so deep rooted. And I think with something like mental health and therapy, especially with older generations, it's still a taboo to talk about within your family. So how do you get past that and get people to actually get the help they need, especially within our community?
I think one thing that's worked quite well for me is, so I grew up in Canada where, it's like therapy is given out like sweets. We had a therapist at school. I've been in therapy since I was 12. I talk about therapy all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think I've got a lot of friendships with people who are British who will sometimes laugh at my propensity to say, like, you should go to therapy, you should see a therapist. Mm. Because I kind of constantly offer that as a solution and constantly offer that as something people should seek. I think actually that's what works. Because just by constantly offering it as something people should try, it normalizes it as a thing that is an option. I think if you make a big deal about it, it continues to be a big deal. I think if you keep referring to it as something, or keep conceptualizing it as something that you only do in a very sort of specific, fringe, extreme scenario, then it remains as something that has a lot of stigma around it. But if you can kind of talk about therapy in a way that you don't have to be going through a deep life-ending sort of crisis to seek therapy. It can be something that you're struggling to understand. It could just be something that everything's great in your life, but you just you want to take it from good to great, perhaps, right? But just constantly just normalizing it through speech. And I found that those friends who will kind of giggle that oh, Raj, you're so North American, we can tell you were raised in Canada, you're constantly suggesting therapy. Few years later, they end up eventually going to therapy. And I'm not sat there nagging them daily, go to therapy, go to therapy. But when they're, talking about their issues or how they feel, if they might be struggling in their marriage or at work, I will listen, and then I will just casually drop in, you should try therapy, could really help. And then eventually, people kind of, you do destigmatize it in that way. Yeah. But I think if you constantly dance around it, it remains something that kind of sits up there that you only really access in fringe, extreme scenarios, when really, it's not really about that.
Yeah, I think that's the problem though, right? Because people see it as a last resort. They think, oh my God, I have to get therapy. That means there must be something really wrong with me.
There's something wrong with all of us. Look at the world we live in. There's not something wrong with you. I want to meet you. How did you get raised in this world, in late stage capitalism in Britain today, and come out without any sort of trauma or anxiety or deep existential despair? Come on, there is something wrong with all of us to some extent. And that's fine. It's not about unwronging yourself. It's just about learning what makes you tick and, what things might plague you and figuring out how to manage them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think talking about it is definitely a step forward, because I think that's always the issue, is they don't want to talk about it. Or when I think about certain members of my own family, they don't want to discuss it. They don't want to know about it. They don't want to
But that's not always linked to therapy. That's also a bit if I talk about it, then it's real. And right now I'm
Yeah, I
just
have to
comfortable in my
accept it.
denial.
Yeah.
I just want to pretend it's all fine.
Yeah, no, true. Well, wise words from you, but this has been such an amazing conversation. I want to thank you for coming on. I know it's been a little while, us getting to know one another initially, and then you're finally here. So
thanks so much for having me.
No, I'm really pleased. And I guess the reason why I wanted you to come on is because you have this amazing full-time job. You're a lawyer, like I said. And on top of that, you are doing all these amazing, projects on the side and raising awareness and like making a difference. And that's so inspirational. So I want to thank you for your time. My last question to you is, what's next on the horizon for you?
AutogenAI, taking it to the next level. So I'm Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of AutogenAI, and that is my day job. And what's next on the horizon for me is that, and seeing where we take this brilliant business and what the amazing team can achieve in our time together.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant.